Chris, good to see you.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here.
I've been reading the survey you helped to design and also implemented with tremendous interest. Tell me more about what are some of the major takeaways from this survey.
Well, before I get started, let me give a little bit of background so you know what it was about.
Yes.
So I work together with my good friends at the Global Semiconductor Association, the GSA, which has a very large global network of semiconductor executives. And we surveyed about close to 150 semiconductor executives, people in the trenches, people actually doing the job, about what the future of the industry will look like. And one of the benefits of this survey is that we got people work throughout all the different parts of the industry. Some of them are deep in the trenches making chemicals, materials, tools, and some of them are actually designing chips for end markets. But also it's very global. So actually about 25% of the participants work for Chinese companies in China. Another 20% work for American companies in the US. And then another large grouping works in Europe. There's a bunch that work across the rest of East Asia, even the Middle East and India. So we're able to compare how different people around the world view the same issues.
Right. And the level of the people that you surveyed?
So they're all the members of the GSA are at the executive level. So these are people with a global perspective.
Right. You know, the reason I ask you this is because there are a lot of hearsay and there's about, what is really going on with the semiconductor industry and what's going to be the future trends, how geopolitics works here. But there's very much lack of data and also specific numbers coming from the community. So I'm so glad that you can help to fill in the blank. So tell me more about your general takeaways from this survey.
So there's a few big messages we got from the people that we surveyed. These are my colleagues in the industry. One is they're very optimistic. About 90% of them believe the industry will grow faster than global GDP. And about 50% believe it will grow much faster than GDP. If you do the math, that means we could get close to $1 trillion industry by 2030. And even though there's fears of price wars and overcapacity, about 60% of people believe that margins will be flat or higher in their segment going forward. And only about 10 to 15% believe margins will shrink, that profits will go down going forward. To me, that's optimism. So the first bench is that people are optimistic. Secondly, everyone is all in on AI. More than 1/2 of participants said that AI is the most important and most attractive segment in which to invest. Thirdly, they are all pessimistic about the impact of geopolitics. And about 1/2 of them said geopolitics is a bigger threat to the industry than commoditization, overcapacity, new entrants, slowing innovation. But strangely, people actually support the policies of their own local government. About 2 out of 3 participants believe local government policies are positive for the industry. The government in the country in which they operate.
I see.
So if you're a Chinese would be saying, this is how I view Chinese government policies, and America would say, this is how I view American government policies.
So they don't have much opinion about geopolitics, and yet they also support their national policies in the industry.
And if we want to dive into that a little bit more, what's interesting is we then asked the policies in the market in which you compete. And again, that could be an American working for an American company in China, talking about the Chinese policies. Are those policies fair? Or are they biased towards local companies? Or are they very biased towards local companies? And we learned something interesting, which is the more people believe the policies are biased towards local companies, the more they supported local government policies. The more they supported the government policies, which makes sense, which is basically people don't like government politics unless it puts money in their pocket.
Indeed. Earlier, I've been also reading some of the other surveys done by GSA. What they said last year, generally speaking, 3 challenges facing semiconductor industry. One is talent, development and retention. Secondly, supply chain disruptions. Thirdly, will be about the development of Gen AI, right? So are those still integrated into the findings that you have been working on this time?
I think talent is always an issue in our industry. We never have enough, but it is also something that is manageable, and people are taking a lot of steps towards managing themselves. The thing about talent is, for the most part, you can control that as a company. You can hire people, you can train people, you can move to another location and get access to the talent in that location. You can offer higher salaries. I think, obviously, when Gen AI just came out, people didn't know what it meant for the industry. And they didn't know, first of all, what it meant from selling products and the strategies they need to have. But they also didn't know, like, how is it going to disrupt my business? How do I build it into my own operations? How do I build in my own sales processes? I think there's been a lot of progress in this. But I still, as in our survey, as we said, one of the things we asked is, yes, to win in AI, is your current strategy enough? Right. More than 80% of companies said no. I need new partners, I need to move faster, I need to get into new business models, I need to do better innovation. So I still think that's very prevalent, like how people want to win in AI, but they know they need to do more. And then finally, I think around the supply chain disruptions, it's no secret that we were in an undersupply mode 12, 18 months ago. We had too much, we had undercapacity, people couldn't get products. We've actually had a bit of a dip in many segments this year, and so we've had some overcapacity. So that was probably a more temporary thing. The semiconductor industry is always cyclical. So sometimes there's too many chips and sometimes there's not enough.
Right. I wanted to ask actually one by one these three areas, because in your survey you really touched on many of those from different perspectives. One is about talents, development and retention. We see this competition among countries, economies, for talents related to semiconductor. We also see some of the most influential manufacturers trying to expand their businesses. For example, some of those coming from the region of Taiwan, going to the United States and establish manufacturing there. So how do you see, and by the way, there are also companies of different countries moving out their research and development R&D centers out of other countries. We saw those are changing landscapes. So how do you see this talent development, talent retention now, the competition and also cooperation?
75 to 80% of your ability to attract talent and build talent has nothing to do with the passport of your leadership. There are well-run companies in every country around the world, and they are able to generate talent, hire people, go to the right places, etc. I do think that, as you said, some companies are pulling R&D specifically out of different markets, but I think those are frankly more point cases. And I think the other thing about it is you have to look at this beneath the surface, because the real reality is it takes about 10 to 15 years to build a good R&D team in our industry.
Tell me more about it.
Well, it's a simple fact. Semiconductors is a scale and learning efficiencies industry. And when I say learning efficiencies, is the fifth time you do something, you're always much better than the first time. And so to build up a new R&D center, no one starts at day one being able to design the most advanced product and bring it to market. You always usually have to start off as a supporting design center where you're doing work from around the rest of the world. Then the next stage would be you're moving up that chain, and instead of just doing what other people tell you to do, you're defining the tasks, but you're not defining the roadmap yet. And then maybe the third step is you're actually defining some low-end or derivative products from the global roadmap, and you're building those and building those out. And then over time you grow, and as you prove it. And so there's something that we say in the semiconductor industry: whenever you're building new products, your first two generations are always terrible. It's always the third one. So if you just look at product cycles, it takes 10 to 15 years to build this up, to actually have R&D leaders in the room who can have a future vision, define a product, and then get a team to do it. And you need that sort of leadership that can train the young people, bring them up to speed, and things like this. I think 90% plus of global semiconductor manufacturing capacity is in Europe, East Asia, and the United States.
East Asia meaning China?
China, Japan,
Taiwan,
Korea, all of that.
Yeah.
Just put it all together, right? Let's simplify to that.
The other thing about supply chains, we heard from the industry insiders last year at least, they're worried about that. And now we know it takes time for the supply chain to be established, well off. So how is it doing so far?
Well, I think, so let me share a few of the results from the survey. And we basically asked companies, are you de-risking your supply chain? And what's actually interesting, a third of them said, no, we're not de-risking. And and that could be for many reasons.
Right.
One reason could be they don't see any risk. They're all in one country anyway. The other one they could say is the risk is not solvable. I can't move the supply chain. Why waste my time? About 1/3 of companies, maybe a little bit less, said, I'm going to split between a US-centric supply chain and a Chinese-centric supply chain, which is a very complicated task. And another 1/3 said, we're not going to split, but we're going to do a bunch of separate actions, maybe move R&D, get different suppliers, all of these things. So different companies are taking very different tactics. And some companies, and of course, building a supply chain is a collective action problem.
Right.
So I want to know what my customers want, and I want to know what my suppliers are doing. Well, my suppliers want to know what I'm doing and what my customers want. So everyone's kind of looking at each other. How do we move this? That's why things move slowly. The other thing that was really interesting from this survey is we asked people, how long will it take for the new supply chain to get built? And far more than half said 5 to 10 years or never. We'll never be done reshuffling our global supply chain. So this is a very long run change. I would not be able to name any company that has been able to fully shift into a fully bifurcated supply chain globally. And that's what we heard. We heard from the respondents, and about 84% of respondents believe there'll be 2 separate global supply chains in the technology industry, one focused on the US, one focused on China. But that many companies will operate across both, and for many different reasons.
Right.
And so they won't be fully separate. They'll have some overlap.
Since you talk about the revenue, let me ask you about that as well. From the survey, you see people are concentrating on 2 areas for their revenue growth. One is automobile, for the semiconductor industry, of course, and the other is AI. So how do you see these 2 different trends developing, especially given the fact that there are also a lot of stories in automobile, as you know. EV is just one of those many stories, and AI, you got new headlines every day. So how do you see people look at the industry, look at these 2 growth revenue directions?
Well, I mean, so firstly, there's just a difference in scale. The compute industry, so think of that compute in your phone, or compute in a server, or compute in your PC, is frankly much, much larger than the automotive semiconductor industry. So it's just a matter of scale. It's maybe 3 to 1, 4 to 1. And so that actually changes the economics quite a bit, because AI and compute is large enough and has enough profit that you can invest heavily in it to drive the next generation of products. Automobiles are a little bit smaller, so the economics of investment are a little bit more difficult. But they have different product cycles. As I said, there's a new model every 6 months. There's a new technology all the time. When we think about Moore's law, that's really about compute. That's really about driving the lowest leading edge. Right. So that means you always have to feed the beast of AI. Automotive traditionally has had very long product cycles. Once you get into a Toyota, or a Kia, or a Hyundai, or a BYD, you're going to be shipping in that car for 10 years because it's very hard to design you out. And so you have lower upfront cost, lower market, but you have a longer tailwind. Right. And so these markets are very different from a competitive perspective. The other big difference which impacts geopolitics is compute traditionally has always been a global market. You know, frankly, a PC in China, a phone in China, or Russia, or Kazakhstan, or India, or the USA, it's basically the same. Maybe the language was different. But the automotive supply chain was always regionalized. Japanese companies buy from Japanese suppliers. European companies buy from European suppliers. American companies buy from American suppliers.
There's some crossover.
There's always some crossover. Nothing is perfect. There's no clear lines, but it's much more regionalized. And so it's a very different dynamic and will move very differently.
The other question is about the different players in the market.
Sure.
Earlier we mentioned China and the United States a lot, but as you just said, that there are also a lot of new kids on the block. Sure. Who wants to play a more pivotal role in the overall market share. For example, you see that from Southeast Asia, you see that from the Middle East, and the list goes on. So how are these players, what is likely to be the chemistry between them and the already existing big players such as China, United States, and rising Europe too?
Sure. So the first thing that the survey told us, and we asked a number of questions we haven't gotten into yet about what region will gain the most market share, what region will attract the most global capital, what region will attract the most talent. But basically, there was a consensus that the existing strong regions in semiconductors will continue to attract the talent, attract the capital. And it goes back to what I said before. This is a learning efficiencies scale market where an installed base and incumbency matters a lot. Secondly, we also asked, is AI going to consolidate power among the leading countries, or is it going to fragment it more? And 90% of people said it will consolidate in the leading countries, but within those countries, enable disruptive companies to come. So then, of course, if you're an aspiring region, you could despair and say, I'm just going to give up. Right. I think it's a slightly different message. I think it's basically about being very focused, about really concentrating your investment on the part of the value chain where you can really make a difference. But most importantly, it's going to be unlikely that you can build new companies from scratch, which would be globally competitive. So you need to become the most attractive place for global companies to invest. Right. And subsidies are going to matter for that. But as you mentioned before, it's about talent, market opportunity, intellectual property protection, other things. For all these regions around the world, let's say there's two supply chains. Are they going to be more likely to use the US-centric technology or the Chinese-centric technology? And some of the results were actually quite expected. So US allies like Europe and Japan and others were expected to much more heavily use US technology. Whereas India, Southeast Asia, and others were expected to have more of a mix. But what was interesting was no one expected any of those countries to create their own separate technology stack independent of the US and China. So there might be kind of only two games in town.